With me today is Alicia Menendez from Univision, and I'm here to discuss the Syrian refugee crisis with someone who is on-the-ground experience and I'm sure can shed some light on an ongoing crisis that many say is just beginning. I understand that you personally visited a Syrian refugee camp and wrote about it in your Generation in Crisis piece. What is life in the camp like?
I would say we were at Zaatari almost a year and a half ago. And so I know what conditions were like a year and a half ago. Zaatari is located in northern Jordan. Many of the Syrian refugees we met had actually crossed the border by foot, and that's how they ended up there. There's a real diversity of life there. For people who have been there a while, they're starting to build homes with fountains and bird cages. They're embracing the idea that they're going to be living there for a while and they need to make this home. And then there are newer arrivals for whom this is much more challenging, who are living in tents, sleeping on the ground, really trying to figure out what their new lives are going to look like. And one of the realities of living the camp, as in the reality of living in any civilization, is that there are also the have and have-nots. There are people who came into the camps with capital, who have the ability to be small business owners, and then there are people who came into the camp with nothing.
Could you give me any insight specifically as to what you saw, what conditions these people were living under in the camp that you visited?
There was definitely a wide range of conditions. So there were certain people and certain homes that were pretty well established. They were caravans that had, in some cases, air conditioning, separate rooms, televisions, working electricity. And then there were other circumstances that were much more dire, people who were in need of medical care, women who either were pregnant or had been pregnant, who were fearful about the conditions into which they were going to be delivering their children. So you really did see a wide range. And yet in the center of this camp, there's this place of commerce called Champs-Élysées, where people have started, it started as a black market, but now people have begun small businesses. They sell everything from ice cream to electronics. And there you see the spirit of these people on full display. And so I think when you ask, who will rebuild Syria, which is the biggest question that we're left with, the answer is the Syrian people are already proving that they have some capacity to do just that.
That's incredibly inspiring that even in this dire situation that they're rebuilding and establishing something new. Mm-hmm. How are these camps managed and or governed?
Well, everything is overseen by the UN. They're the actual governing force of the camps. And at the same time, part of what we learned when we were there is that that was not enough, right? That they needed to actually have sort of these neighborhood groups that would in many ways govern the camp. That there were bosses, each neighborhood had a boss, but then each section had a big boss. And so they felt they needed representation on the actual refugee level.
Wow, so it's sort of a civilization microcosm.
Absolutely.
All right. What conditions did you see them living under?
The conditions, in some ways, there were parts that you would never expect, right? There are a lot of people who have internet access and are on smartphones. These are refugees from an educated, middle-class country who wanted to bring some of the pieces of that with them into the refugee camp. And then there are many, who do not have basic necessities and who are struggling to get by. So there's a diversity of living situations within the camp.
Oh, just like any country, haves and have-nots, as you said. Are they being properly cared for?
I don't know that you can issue a blanket statement about whether or not, the refugees are being appropriately cared for. When we talk to representatives from the UN, they were very clear. They have an unbelievable list of necessities. And so within that list of necessities for offering care, they have to prioritize very basic things like water and hygiene. And in that way, it did seem that the UN had been able to structure the camps to really offer those basic necessities.
As for security, are they, being kept safe?
I can only speak from our experience as journalists, and our experience as journalists was that it was difficult to get into the camps, both in terms of long-term lead on the project, but then also that, when we drove up, you really got the sense that it was being heavily guarded.
Well, it's good to know they're safe. Within this camp, have they been able to live relatively peacefully keeping in mind that they were displaced from their homes and forced to flee?
I mean, based on my first-person accountings, yes, of course, it did seem on a moment-to-moment basis that things were peaceful. There are certainly accountings, though, of violence within camps, sometimes sexual violence against young women. We did not witness any of that firsthand.
Desperate people can be unpredictable. Is education provided for the children in these camps? And if so, what form does it take on?
Education is provided, and yet it's extremely challenging. About more than half of the refugees that are living in these camps are under the age of 18 and need formal education. So there's a disparity between what the camps are able to provide and then also what people are willing to take advantage of.
Was there anything you saw or heard that really grabbed your attention or caught you off guard, something that surprised you?
Yeah, there were so many children. And I think I can sort of sit here and say to you over 50%, and yet when you're with them and you see how alive they are and how curious they are and how full of energy they are, you realize that this crisis is a generational crisis, and there's a question not only of what happens to those children now in the camps, but what happens when it is time to rebuild their country.
Well, it's good to know that they still have the energy of life in them, that they're not completely beaten down, and that they're moving on in whatever small way that might take. How long have you been studying the Syrian refugee crisis?
I am by no means an expert on this crisis, but my interest in looking at what was happening in Syria was we kept hearing so much about a lost generation and this idea that, if you had a generation that was disconnected from their homeland, that did not have the educational resources necessary, that you had the potential that all of that opportunity would be squandered. And so we started by looking at young Syrians, and then we extrapolated out to look at another country, Rwanda, that had experienced a very similar displacement 20 years ago, looked at the investments they had made in education and infrastructure as a way of rebuilding what otherwise would have been a lost generation. And then we also brought the story to a domestic audience by looking at our neighbors to the south. We went specifically to El Salvador to ask what happens when young people leave with no intention of ever returning home.
Based on your experience in the camp, did you get any sense of how these refugees felt towards Western culture, just in the West in general? Was there a pro-West sentiment, anti-West sentiment?
Walking into the camp, we are undeniably Westerners, and most of the people we spoke with were incredibly warm, incredibly gracious, eager to tell their story, generous with their story, generous with the little bit that they had. Everywhere we went, people wanted to feed us and share with us, and so no, it was my experience that this was a warm and welcoming people.
Do you have any inkling as to how things may have changed for the refugees since you visited the camp?
I mean, one of the things that we do know since the time that we were there almost a year and a half ago is that there is now real questions on the part of these receiving countries about how much they can continue to give and how long this can go on for. Because in addition to the refugees that are living inside of the camps, there are also refugees that are now integrating into these larger societies, which raises questions about employment, about education, and about the amount of resources that are being spent. So I think since we were last there, I think things have changed much more on a global level. You asked me earlier, one of the things I noticed, and I said that I noticed a lot of children. The other thing you notice is a pretty significant absence of men. And that is either because they are still fighting in Syria or because they have passed in fighting in Syria. And so you do have a disproportionate number of households that are headed by women. And we saw that both in terms of the families that we would sit down and talk with, but then also just walking around the camp, you realize how it is dominated by women and children.
Welcome. Today I'm with Jorge Ramos from Univision and the Fusion Television Network. Currently, there is a controversy in the United States about whether to admit Syrian refugees. Now, and this controversy is now punctuated by the recent terror attack in Brussels. As someone familiar with the Cuban refugee crisis in the United States, do you see parallels between the two?
Yeah, because we are a country of immigrants, and we've had a wonderful tradition, more than 2 centuries, in which we are always opening up our arms to those who are coming after us. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. This country gave me the opportunities that my country of origin couldn't give me. So I would like this country to treat the immigrants who came after me exactly with the same generosity. Here in Miami, in this place, I've seen how this community has accepted first Cuban Americans, and then it was people from Central America fleeing from the wars. After that, it was Colombia. Now we're seeing a lot of people coming from Venezuela, fleeing from the dictatorship in Venezuela. We have to remember that we, as a country, we were responsible for the war in Iraq. That changed the whole situation in that region. And partly because of that, there has been so much instability that we have to deal with that. So I think it is part of the tradition of the United States to accept refugees, and I think we should continue doing that.
Today, there seems to be a climate of suspicion towards refugees. Did the Cuban refugees encounter the same climate, and how did they overcome it?
It was exactly the same. I think it is really interesting because back then, during the Cuban refugee crisis, there were tens of thousands of Cubans coming to our coast. They called them Marielitos because they came from the port of Mariel, therefore the Marielitos. And back then, if you were to call someone Marielito, you were suggesting that he was a criminal. That was incredibly unfair. And nowadays, when people here in the United States are talking about Syrian refugees or refugees coming from the Middle East, there's the suspicion, completely unfounded, but there's the suspicion that those refugees could be terrorists. So exactly the same thing happened with the Marielitos, with the Cuban Americans now here in the United States. They assumed that they were criminals simply because some of them were, not all of them, but just some of them. And in this case, the Syrian refugees are facing exactly the same problem. They're being portrayed as terrorists or a threat to the United States when they're really not.
There is a perception that Syrian refugees will not want to assimilate because of the culture clash between the Middle East and the West. Did Cuban refugees have the same experience?
You might, for instance, you can ask me or you can ask Cuban Americans here. I speak with an accent. So you can suggest that we are not assimilating fast enough. I would say exactly the opposite, that this is a country not only of immigrants, but it's a country of many different accents, and that we are providing and contributing much more to the economy and to the culture, to the cuisine of this country, and that it is great for the United States to have immigrants. There's always the controversy if we should assimilate completely, or if we just should integrate. In other words, if we should keep parts of our country's culture and bring it to the United States. And it is my experience. What I've noticed is that it takes a few generations, not to assimilate completely, but to integrate completely to the United States. I can give you an example. I still speak with an accent. I've been here for 33 years. But if you talk to my son Nicholas, he feels completely American. He's bilingual though. But when you ask him about his identity, he says, I'm from the United States, proudly from the United States. So in my case, in my family, it took, I would say it took 2 generations to fully assimilate or integrate to the United States.
I completely agree that different cultures enrich this country, by the way. And I found it very interesting what you said about completely assimilating versus integrating. It's like the melting pot versus the salad.
Yeah.
Because in a melting pot it blends together, but in the salad you have all the different parts existing together in harmony.
I agree with you, and I think it is incredibly rich for a country to be able to bring elements from other cultures, because it gives you strength, and it is just fantastic. I don't think that it is a coincidence that we have in this country a tech industry that created the iPhone, the computers, that created the possibility of sending the first man on the moon. I think it says about the creativity that we have in this country. the fact that, of course, we come from a long, beautiful tradition of immigration.
Yeah. So innovation and creativity from variety.
See the number of immigrants who have created so many great things to this country. And then you would ask,
count them all, there's so many.
exactly, and then you would think, well, why they didn't do it in their country of origin? Well, simply because the elements, the conditions were not there for that to happen. While here in the United States, you come to this country and then suddenly you have opportunities. I know a doctor called, his name is Alfredo Quiñones. He's a doctor. He came to the United States as an immigrant. He worked in the tomato fields. And now he's one of the most successful and famous neurosurgeons in the world. Had he stayed in Mexico, most likely he wouldn't be picking up tomatoes, but not in the United States, not here.
How did Cuban refugees sort of get rid of the suspicion they found when they arrived here?
By being successful, by doing great things, by being in control of the city. A good friend of mine tells me that Miami is one of the few places in the United States where Latinos feel first-class citizens. And when you are confronted with suspicion, when people are saying you're a Marielito, you're a criminal, the best revenge is success. And they've shown success by controlling some of the most important industries in the city, by electing mayor after mayor after mayor from Cuban origin, from imposing on everybody el café cubano, el cafecito. So the best revenge is success, and that's precisely what those immigrants did here, and those refugees did here in Miami.
So being successful, throwing off suspicion, and making positive contributions all at the same
And
time.
good coffee.
Oh yeah, of course, good coffee. I wouldn't know because I don't drink coffee.
I don't drink coffee either. You know, that's one of the things that I never learned. But it's good. You got to try it, and it's going to keep you awake for 2 days.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. In what spirit do these refugees uproot their lives and face such a perilous journey? Like, for someone like me who's lived here my whole life, I can't imagine just uprooting my entire existence and going on a journey that may or may not succeed to a land far, far away. What do they hope to achieve, do you think?
One of the most difficult things in life, one of the most courageous decisions for anyone is precisely that, to say goodbye to your country and try something completely different. There was a French traveler and writer, Alexis de Tocqueville. He used to, are you familiar with him?
Yes.
Yeah. So what he wrote is fantastic. What do you remember about him?
He wrote a thesis on what made America so successful, and he said it was the openness with which they accepted people from all walks of life, and it was this mixing, this freedom to express yourself. It's democracy. That's what made America beautiful.
So, Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a wonderful line that said that the rich and the powerful don't go into exile. In other words, that if you have a lot of money, if you're powerful, you can stay in your country of origin. But if you are poor, if you are facing a corrupt government, if you have no possibilities, you're going to look for something else. So immigration is simply explained by forces that push you out of your country and forces that pull you into another one. And that's precisely what has happened here in the United States.
How is the U.S. government to respond to, the sheer number of refugees arriving at their doorstep? Should there be a difference in treatment between, like, for example, just to give an example, should there be a difference in treatment between economic refugees and political refugees?
That's an interesting question, but no, I don't think so. I think that if you're escaping from Cuba, from Mexico, and from Syria, it would be almost impossible for me to determine that you are fleeing that country because of simply economic reasons. If you're fleeing Mexico, we could argue that it has to do with the drug violence, or it has to do with a corrupt government. If you're fleeing from Cuba, we might say that, of course, it has to do with a dictatorship, but at the same time, because of the dictatorship, you don't have the economic capabilities and opportunities to do otherwise. So it is almost impossible to separate politics from economy. So I would just, I would treat them both the same way, exactly the same way. Now, I understand that there's some concern about bringing in refugees from countries that are facing right now terrorism. So you just simply do what any other country would do. Just do background checks, make sure that everybody who's coming here is not a terrorist, and then move on. That's what we've been doing very successfully for many, many decades. When I became a US citizen, it was a long, long process. It took years. Really took years to get ready for that. So if you just follow exactly the same way, nothing's going to happen. I think we're a very strong country. I don't think we should live in a country that is afraid of the world. I think we have to live in a country that is open to the rest of the world. And we know exactly how to do things right. And I think that self-assurance is sometimes, we're lacking that self-assurance. I love that this is a country open to the world, and I just hate to see it turning into a country afraid of the world. We shouldn't become that country. I don't want to be living, and many people don't want to be living in a country like that.
It's a very good point that we should have open arms and accept the world.
Exactly. So just imagine a country completely closed off to the world. Right now we have trade and commerce and immigration with Mexico and Latin America, with Europe, with Asia, and then suddenly, because of fear that we would close our borders and say, no, let's just stay here so we can be controlled. Well, let me tell you something. The homegrown terrorism is more dangerous. Yep. Remember what happened in Oklahoma City, or what happened in San Bernardino, or even, I would call that a terrorist act, what happened in Sandy Hook, where just one person killed 20 children. So just to close off all borders is not the solution.
Because you can't sustain it. It's unsustainable.
Exactly.
The Cuban refugees were very successful in assimilating and maintaining their culture at the same time, their cultural identity. Do you have an opinion about whether Syrian refugees will be able to do the same?
Absolutely. Yeah, I see no reason why not. And usually what happens, it takes a couple of generations, as we said, to integrate, not fully assimilate, but integrate into the United States. So I would expect them to speak their language, to cook their own food, to maintain certain elements from their country of origin. That happens a lot. I still I love Mexican food. I still listen to music in Spanish and read the newspaper in Spanish every single day. But at the same time, I'm reading the New York Times and talking to you in English and having conversations with media in English and trying to be part of this country as much as possible. I'm voting now here in this country. So it takes a while. It's not that easy. But at the end, that's precisely the beauty of this country.
Thank you so much. What you said has been invaluable in reminding, well, hopefully a lot of people through this, that it's important to not give in to fear, to make sure that, so just check who they are, but make sure that you give them access to the American dream, as we have for so many people before.
It's a lovely thing that you said. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Congratulations.
Thank you.